What are you doing? Part 2 of The Explorer by Catherine Rundle. This chapter is called The Den. It was ferociously hot and he was still alive. Those were his first thoughts that came to Fred as he opened his eyes and found himself staring straight up at the Brazilian sun. Instinctively he looked down at his wristwatch, but the face was cracked and the minute hand had fallen off. The two girls were asleep next to him. Both of them were covered in blood and scabs, but they were breathing easily. Con had a thumb in her mouth. There was a host of dragonflies in luminous blues and reds dancing around them. He thought they might be attracted to the bloods, but there was no sign of the little boy. Max was missing. "Max," Fred whispered, jumping to his feet. There was no answer, no movement, except the burr of the dragonfly wings. Fred's heart started to pound. "Max," he called louder. Lila stirred in her sleep. He ran to the edge of the trees. There was no trace of the boy. "Max," he roared, staring wildly around. I know why I'm missing words. I haven't put my glasses on yet. That's better. "Max," he roared, staring wildly around. "What?" Max looked up. He was lying on his stomach behind some fur-lined plants, next to the vile-smelling puddle, plashing his fingers in the water. That is saying splashing. That's not me this time. "Max," Fred ran over to him, wincing as one of his ribs protested sharply. "You haven't been drinking that water, have you?" Max stared up at Fred as he approached, and then screwed his eyes shut and let out a scream that shook the baby flesh in his cheeks. Across the clearing, Lila gave a yell as she startled awake. "That's not very flattering," said Fred to Max, but it was possibly, he reckoned, that covered in blood and soot, with less eyebrows than usual, he didn't look very reassuring. The boy kept screaming, barely drawing a breath. Lila jumped to her feet. "Max," she called, "what's happening?" Sugar, Fred thought. He knew what you should have given people for shock. "Do you want a sweet?" He had some mint humbugs in his pocket. "Please stop crying." He fished the sweets out. His hand came out wet. There was a cut on his thigh and half-dry blood in his pocket, and the mints had spent the night marinating in it. Nice. The taste hadn't been improved, but the sugar gave his blood a twitch. "Do you want one of these?" Fred spat on a corner of his shirt and polished one clean. "It's a mint." Sounds typical scout action. "No, I hate mints," said Max. "It's the only food I've got." "Oh, then I'll take it," said Max. He said it like a lord accepting a peasant's bread. "Here," said Fred. He put it in the boy's sticky hand. "Eat it slowly if you can." Max sucked loudly. His nose began to run down past his lips and onto his chin. "Max," Lila called, "come here." "Come on," said Fred. The boy's face was intent on working on the mint. His eyebrows furrowed in concentration. He looked very breakable. Fred felt his chest tighten, but he said only, "You should probably blow your nose." "I don't blow my nose," said Max. They walked, both limping, towards Lila. "It's not a thing to do." "I think you should." "No." And then Max licked the snot off his upper lip and added it to his mouthful of mints. 5-year-olds were not easy to argue with, Fred thought. Max had a sweep of dirt encrusted on his cheek, and his eyebrows turned up at the corners to give his face a mischievous tilt. Fred hooked his finger into Max's shirt collar to steer him from the thorns and what looked like rabbit's droppings. The ground was mossy, speckled with patches of grass and creeper. One of the trees had scarlet flowers that had fallen and red carpeted the forest floor. Sitting among the flowers under the bright white sun, Leela and Con were arguing. "You, boy, what's your name?" Fred, called Con, come and tell this girl she's completely wrong. She thinks, began Leela, flushing. Obviously, I think we should go back and wait near the plane, said Con, in case they see it from the air so they can rescue us. It makes more sense to stay here, said Leela. She pulled her knees up to her chin. We've just got lost, trying to find our way back, and I don't think anybody will see the plane. They don't know where we crashed. They'll have to search the entire jungle. We're on our own. She fixed her eyes on a dandelion-like plant, fierce and unblinking. We'll have to wait to find a way to get to Manus ourselves. Fred looked at the girl properly. She had a scratch across one side of her narrow face and hair woven in two dark plaits, one of which had been charred in the crash. She wore a scarlet skirt and blood-red top, both now stained grey-green. She looked about his age. She was scowling at Con, and Con glared back. That's crazy. We need to stay near the plane and wait to be rescued. My family will have sent dozens of planes to search for us by now. 100 planes, probably. But, said Leela, where we crashed is burnt by the fire. Half the trees are charcoal, and so there'll be no animals. We don't need animal friends, said Con. This isn't a fairy tale. For us to eat, finished Leela. And back there, well, there's what, said Con. There's the pilot. He's dead, said Con. She seemed genuinely puzzled. He can't hurt us. Leela spoke very quietly, but Fred was surprised by how authoritatively she sounded. We should make camp here. No, said Con. That's completely illogical. Fred, said Leela, you get the deciding vote. No, he doesn't, said Con. That's not fair. One person shouldn't get to decide. She glared at Fred from foot to chin. Not unless he agrees with me. Fred looked around the clearing again. The air was fresh here, and the sky above them, a blue that does not exist in England. He was just about to answer when he saw that at the far end, where the forest grew thick and tangled, 4 trees had fallen together, their tops meeting in a point. The very tips of the hair on the back of Fred's neck began to rise. Do you think there's anything odd about this clearing, he said. There's not an answer to that question, said Con. Why, asked Leela. Those trees, he said, over there, and he pointed. What about them? Well, they fell over, said Con. That's what trees do. But they don't look like they fell to me, said Fred. He ran across the clearing. A sense was arising in him that something was strange. His curiosity pushed aside his fear. The largest of the trees was immense. Its trunk was as thick and tall as Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. 3 small trees leant against the thicker one. Each had grown a few feet from the next in a rough square. Their branches were entwined and darkened by green creepers. Leave it alone, Fred called Con. Stay in the open. There's something odd here. He ran his hands down one of the smaller trees, and at the base was a mess of fern-like plants and a few mushrooms. He pushed the ferns down and felt his stomach swoop. The 3 smaller trees didn't have roots. They were logs, 15 feet high, each carefully tipped against the central tree. He could see where they'd been hacked with an axe or a machete. Ferns had grown or been planted, Fred thought, at their bases, disguising the places where the cuts were shown. A den, breathed Fred. What did you say? Called Con. Fred pushed at the vines and then stretched between each of the logs. It's like a tent, said Fred. A den. He bent down, ready to push past the foliage. No, don't go in there, said Con. It came out in a burst. It's not that I'm scared, but please don't. It's not a reasonable risk. Fred stared at her. A what? He'd never in his life considered whether a risk was reasonable. It sounded like something his headmaster would say, or the scoutmaster. There could be anything in there, jaguars, snakes or rats, said Con. cannot look, said Fred, astonished. She might be right, though, said Leela, about the snakes. Be careful. Okay, I'll look, said Max, grandly, jumping to his feet. No, you absolutely won't, said Leela, grabbing his wrist. You're staying right here. Fred pushed aside the vines hanging down between the logs. Ah! He winced. Some of the tendrils had tiny but vicious thorns, and they'd caught in one of his cuts. He brushed away another handful of vines and froze. His heart, which hadn't stopped double beating since the crash, quickened to a triple speed. The trees met to make a tent high enough for a man to kneel in, or for someone Max's height to stand in at least. The air smelt deep green. There was a spiderweb in one corner, and below it was a pile of banana leaves, stacked a dozen leaves thick in the shape of a sleeping mat. They had been almost entirely devoured by ants, but Fred looked up and felt his eyes stretch wide. Come and look at this, he called. The space between the 4 tree trunks had once been covered in a roof of plaited palm leaves. He reached up and touched them. The palms were riddled with holes, half rotted, and the light shone through, but he could see how intricately they'd been woven. He crawled further in, slowly looking for snakes in the green light. The ground squelched under his hands. In the far corner of the den was a hollow gorod, rotten with mildew. Fred touched it gingerly, and it was mulchy. He turned it upside down, wrinkled his nose at the smell as a cascade of flints spilled out. Half had been chipped into the shape of arrowheads. Others were square and squat, large as a fist. You two! He crawled backwards and stuck his head through the vines. Come in, quick! You have to see this. Someone was here. You're crazy, spat Con. If someone was here, they won't want us trespassing. I've had enough of this. She turned and began to march back into the trees. Wait, Con. We shouldn't split up, called Fred, infuriated. He scrambled out of the den and ran after her. Whose house is it? She turned to face him. Fred was startled. There were tears in her eyes. You don't know, do you? Of course I don't, said Fred. But I just think... Well, what if they come back? I've read about it in... Con hesitated, casting around for an idea. Goldilocks. I know how it ends. I'm not getting eaten by bears. I'm pretty sure this place wasn't built by bears, said Fred. It could be cannibals. Cannibals are mostly shy and a myth, said Leela. Says who? Everyone. Scientists. Our mamas and our papas. Well, how do they know? Mama grew up in the jungle near the Solomos River, and she's a scientist, a botanist. Botanist, said Max. Con scowled at him, the nerves in her face twitching. You overrate the wit of the word, bottom. Leela put a protective arm around Max and went on as if she hadn't been interrupted. And our papa's English, and he studied the plants of the jungle for medicine. And our grandmother, well, she was a scientist's assistant. We were supposed to be going to visit her in England. We were going to get the boat from Manus. She wanted to meet us before she died, you know. She wanted to see what Max was like. Con snorted. Perhaps it's just as well we crashed. Leela ignored that. Listen, whoever lives here, if they come back, might be able to take us to Manus. Or they could eat us for dinner, said Con. She stared from Leela to Fred, angry and bewildered. Just come inside, said Fred. You'll see. Nobody's been here for ages. Grudgingly, very slowly, Con turned round. She bent down and edged into the shelter. Leela and Max followed. Fred pulled at the rotten leaves lining the roof. We could weave new leaves for the ceiling, he said, and make new beds, and then it would smell less like an old sock. He began gathering armfuls of decomposed foliage and pushing it outside. Underneath, the earth was soft and dusty. It smelled of 1,000 warm days, layered one over the other. Leela brought in an armful of leaves, each as big as a pillowcase. She began to lay them down for beds. And we could hang some extra vines over the front of the den, said Fred, so nothing can see in. Con crouched in the shelter with her arms crossed. Who died and made you king? She said. Nobody, Fred turned and startled. But we're going to have to sleep here. We might as well make it waterproof. I'm not sleeping here, said Con. Somebody could come back here any second. But they won't, said Fred. Did you see those flints? Yes. Well, they're covered in moss, he said. So they're dirty. They've been there a long time. We're going to be fine. How is it that's supposed to be reassuring, said Con. He means they're old, said Leela. It's been deserted here. But why do you want to risk it, said Con. What if they come back and think we're intruders? And what if they're never coming back and they've left this behind as a shelter, said Leela. Her voice wasn't loud, but there was a toughness to it. If somebody was here, that means somebody else thought it was a good place to rest. It means it's safe. But how can you know for sure? We can't know anything for sure, said Fred. Leela's right. As soon as we work out how to get out of here, we'll leave. But until then, it makes sense to stay in a place where other people have been. Unless, of course, they eat us, said Con. I'm staying here, said Max. I want to live in a tree tent, and if you try to make me move, I'll do a wee on you. No, you won't, Con backed away, smacking her head on a tree trunk. He does sometimes do that, said Leela, which, for the moment at least, more or less, settled it. Don't miss the next chapter.